urban sanitation infrastructure, as well as Shanghai as a complex urban environment. Now, right before making this presentation, I've decided to make my presentation today raw or rawer than you expected, so that you can understand how research projects come to be and how the identity of urban researcher come to be, rather than just looking at 100% completed research project and feeling intimidated. So now, can people please mute themselves? Otherwise, we will have echoes in the presentation. Thank you very much. So before I start everything, I just want to introduce you two fundamental concepts with regard to urban sanitation infrastructure. One is, I highlight the name here, the surface-based sanitation infrastructure, which means after accessing to sanitation facility, the emptying, collecting, and transport of human waste is done by human labor. However, everything is mechanicalized, which means there is no direct contact between human waste and those who are working on sanitation service. And as such, this represents an ideal and safely managed model of urban sanitation infrastructure. The second kind of sanitation infrastructure is probably much more commonly seen in the global north, where everything is networked and connected to municipal sewers. That means all houses, business buildings, factories, they all have access to sanitation water. Everything will be flushed down to drainage and then flow under the pipe and then be connected to the sewer system, then flow to the treatment plants. Human waste and sewage will then be treated and reused. Again, as you can see from this diagram, there's no direct contact between human and wastewater or human waste whatsoever. So this represents another ideal version of sanitation infrastructure, which is networked. But these two diagrams here represent what things are or how they're supposed to be in a perfect world. In real life, often we can observe that the service chain is either not complete or there is a mixture of both. And there is a shared issue in these two diagrams, which is these two diagrams assume that there is access to sanitation already. So in these two slides, you see sanitation facilities, or in a simple term, a toilet is already drawn into the diagram. But in the reality, that is not exactly the case, because soon you will see that many people in the world don't even have access to sanitation facilities. But keep these two fundamental concepts in mind, because they will be mentioned repeatedly in my following presentation. So firstly, why sanitation and why this is important? Now, a call that my research on urban sanitation infrastructure is responding to is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs for short. So this is a universal call that urges all countries to jointly work towards to, and it indicates that, be careful about this, that by the year of 2030, we should achieve a better and more sustainable future. And as you can tell, this is a very ambitious call because it's already the end of the year of 2021. There is 17 SDGs in this United Nations goals, and all of them are interconnected. So these goals are integrated with each other, which means outcomes in one goal or one area will have impact on other areas. while my research largely talk about access to sanitation and water and how it triggers social conflicts and struggles, it is directly related to SDG Goal 6, which aims to ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. But as I mentioned, all these 70 goals are interconnected. So my research, except from having direct relation with SDG 6, also has impact on, for example, SDG Goals 11, which concerns sustainable cities and communities. This is also very relevant to SDG 10, which aims to reduce inequalities. Then if we have a look at SDG 3 and 5, good health and well-being and gender inequalities, these all involve around adequate access to sanitation and water. So the United Nations recognized that right to adequate water and sanitation is fundamental to attaining all other human rights. This is obviously not difficult to understand because without access to adequate water and sanitation, then the human being's most fundamental physical needs cannot be supported. And inadequate access to water and sanitation can be a huge risk to public health. So this is why the United Nations, when they developed these 17 goals of SDGs, have developed this very powerful urge on providing universal access to sanitation and water, which is leave no one behind. Now this is a necessary and powerful statement, but when we see leave no one behind, I here have put down a question mark. So is this feasible and is this the case? And where do we stand in this progress? I'm gonna explain my question mark. So on this slide here, I'm showing you the current progress of providing access to sanitation and water on global level. Let's have a look at the picture on the left-hand side. So in the year of 2020, about 26% of the global population do not have access to safely managed drinking water. Now this is a very concerning issue because water really supports our very fundamental needs. And a more concerning fact is that about 46% of global population do not have access to safely managed sanitation. Now, these are always being long-standing urban issues. However, in the year of 2020, when the global pandemic of COVID-19 happened, this has become more urgent than ever because these marginalized and disadvantaged people who do not have access to clean water and sanitation are in urgent public health risk because they cannot wash their hands properly, they cannot be quarantined properly. On the right-hand side, here's a map indicating you the uneven distribution of access to sanitation and water. The darker the color is, the more concerning the situation is, and the slower the progress is. So as you can tell from the map that most of the global South countries are still struggling quite a lot with providing universal access to sanitation and water. And this is why I've set my eyes on the global South cities, and in Shanghai in particular, as an instance of global South cities. Now, I've briefly talked about access to sanitation and water, either in my design studio or in my research seminar groups. Most of you, when I talk about access to sanitation and water, you look a bit puzzled, which is understandable and definitely expected. Because for most of us, sanitation infrastructure work like this. So every network system is buried underground. It is invisible. It is the background of our everyday urban living. It only becomes visible when it breaks down, but that is very rare. But we all have access to sanitation facilities. We are all able to flush, and whatever is flushed down will be treated properly. In the UK, for example, 97% of urban sewage is treated via networked sewer system, which can roughly translate it as 97% of the population are using networked sewer system. And the rest 3% either use small septic tank or other human surface-based system, but all human waste are being properly treated, and most of urban residents have access to a sanitation facility. That's why most of you are puzzled when I ask about sanitation facilities, because we are lucky enough to have this everyday access, and it is never an issue to use the toilet or to wash our hands even during the time of a global pandemic. But what about the rest 46% of the global population? What about those marginalized social groups, billions of people who cannot access clean water and sanitation? How sanitation infrastructure work in these scenarios? How can we tackle the issues? What can we do to improve the service and to help with public health and individual urban living experience? Now, that's a lot of questions, and I have to admit that I do not have answers to all of these questions. I only have answers to a very small portion of these questions. But in today's presentation, I hope that my narrative can help you start thinking about these questions, and in the upcoming decades of times, as an urban researcher and designers, you can always bear these questions in mind. Now, whenever I have a chance, I tend to promote my research project a little bit. So my work is part of the international project of SASI, which look at sanitation transformation in Shanghai as an example of global south megacities. I've attached the website of SASI here on the slide. So if you're interested, do visit our website. We do not only look at China or Shanghai. We also have parallel sister program in India and Brazil, both taken as representatives of global south countries. So if you're interested, every information is on the website. Now let's talk a little bit about Shanghai and why we choose it. Two rows of symbol numbers here. So on the first row here, that indicate the first part of the number here indicates Shanghai's overall city population, and second part of the number here is Shanghai's city population density. And then on the second row here, I've write down the population number of the whole UK and population density of the whole UK. And as you can see, Shanghai has almost 10 times population density than the UK, which makes it one of the most densest cities in the world. And it is also one of the largest in the world, which means we're looking at a very dense and complex urban environment. Now, when we think of Shanghai, we think of this famous promotion image, right? It looks carefully designed, beautifully planned. Everything looks very much gentrified, and urban infrasystems, including sanitation infrasystems, are invisible. So they're buried underground, they support everyday urban living, and they're never expected to be an issue. So this is the wanted image of Shanghai. So this is a proposed modernized urban environment. But this has always troubled me, because as an urban researcher, it is impossible for me to think of a city that consists of only one urban environment or one urban typology, which looks perfect on the surface. To me, this looks closer to the real Shanghai. This looks more realistic to a global south megacity. So this picture was taken by me during my field study back in 2019 in Shanghai. And I think this represents Shanghai perfectly, because that tells us about the fragmentation of Shanghai's urban space, and how infrastructures are being scattered and placed in different places of the urban environment. So in this picture alone, we can easily identify 2-3 different types of sanitation infrastructure. For example, if we look at the background of the picture, we look at this modernized high-rising building, a very desired urban image where everyone has access to water flush private toilet, and they can flush their toilet and everything is flushed down to the connected sewer system. Then in the middle of the picture here, we see these multi-floored 1990s buildings, which all of the residents will have access to private sanitation facilities, i.e. water flush toilet, and they can flush anytime they want. But then human waste and wastewater are flushed down to a septic tank, and then this septic tank will be emptied and transported. The human waste will be transported by human surface. So this is more close to the first diagram I showed earlier on, which is surface-based sanitation system. But then the majority part of this picture indicates another kind of sanitation infrastructure where people living in these traditional houses or yet to be transformed urban environments do not have access to private sanitation. So what they have to do is they have to defecate in a bucket toilets, or what we call as night pot in Chinese language, and they have to carry this night pot to a community or public waste collection station, empty these night pots using their own hands, which triggers direct contact between human and human waste. And then they have to carry these emptied night pots back home to wash them in their sink, where they do their everyday food washing and clothes washing. And then the human waste collection station will be again emptied by municipal service. So if we again think back to that service-based sanitation chain, then the left half of the sanitation infrastructure actually remains the same. It is emptied and transported by municipal service, and there is no direct human contact. Whereas the first part of the sanitation chain triggers many socioeconomic issues, because this is where people do not have access and where people have to make direct contact with human waste and wastewater. As such, Shanghai's everyday urban life and its overall cityscape is largely impacted by this inadequate access to sanitation. So on the upper half of the slide here, you can see how the cleaning, the washing of night pots is done, and how these night pots back in early communist era are being transported by human labor for treatment. But up until today, if we look at picture 3, this is still a normality in central Shanghai, where residents in yet to be transformed urban environments have to carry their night pot and go to a small waste collection station and empty the night pot using their hands. On the bottom half of the slide here, you can see many of the cityscape and public infrastructure are developed centered around sanitation needs. For example, the ship docks and the ships are developed to transport human waste that are collected from city center. And in picture 6, which is the last picture here, this is a look of a public human waste collection station, which is emptied and maintained by municipal service on a everyday basis. But I've just said that Shanghai is a complex urban environment, so it's very hard for us to find just one urban typology or one kind of environment in Shanghai. And most of the time, different scenarios and different urban typologies coexist in a city, and this is precisely the case in Shanghai. So in my research, I look at different scenarios, or you may want to call them different stages of urban development. So I look at this high-rise, very dense urban environment, which looks very modernized, and everything is networked. And my question when looking at this scenario will be leaning towards what is the capacity of municipal sewer system, who implanted them, who maintain them and repair them if there is paradoxes. Whereas if I look at a different scenario, which is an urban environment that has been developed between early communist era and the year of 2000, then I'm in fact looking at a mix of networked system and human service-based sanitation system, which means parts of the toilets here in the community are connected to network sewer system, and parts of them are connected to septic tanks that need to be emptied regularly by municipal service. Whereas looking at this scenario, my questions will be leaning towards to whether this combination or mix of network system and surface-based system can achieve sustainability outcome in a dense transforming environment. So my question will be different when I'm looking at this high-rise, modernized, and gentrified urban typology. Then my question will be further different when I look at a different urban typology, which is what I'm demonstrating here on this slide. These yet to be transformed urban environment, these urban typology, before the year of 2000, used to accommodating 65% of Shanghai's overall population. Now, after the year of 2000, many of them have been demolished and redeveloped into more modernized high-rise urban typology, whereas it still remains commonly seen in inner Shanghai, and tens of thousands of people's everyday life are still accommodated by this urban typology. And this is what a old Shanghai everyday living would look like in these areas. So when I'm looking at this scenario or this stage of urban transformation, my question will be again different to the previous two scenarios. And my current questions and research are very much centered around inequalities that are triggered by inadequate access to sanitation. So let me explain my study site more to give you some more context on these areas. So these yet to be transformed urban typology now largely accommodate two kinds of social groups. One is local retirees who have been living in these areas for decades of time and get deeply attached to local environment and to the neighborhood. And B, migrant workers who come to Shanghai to work for the city for some light labor work, and most of them are rural to urban migrants. They cast in these urban environments because rent in these areas are extremely low, and that is only possible for them to set their foot in Shanghai as a megacity. However, sanitation access in these areas are extremely limited. Most of the residents here, no matter they're natives or migrants, do not have access to private sanitation. This is when inequalities arise. So for outsider, when we walk into these urban environments, we look at this small grey house in the background of the image. That is precisely a public human waste collection station. So on the left-hand side, this door here leads to a public urinal, which can be used by men in the community. Whereas on the right-hand side here, this small dot here, is the opening of waste collection station. So people have to carry their full night pot here and open a small door and empty their night pot into this small opening. So for outsider, for example, when I first arrived in this area, this appeared as unhygienic and it's definitely smelly, anyone can detect it. Whereas for local older people, this has been an integral part of their everyday life for decades of time. And many of their social lives are comfortably developed around these areas. But that triggers exclusion because their children and grandchildren are now moved out and are not willing to visit them back in the community because this sanitation infrastructure is considered backwards. So these old people live alone, and it's very rare that they have visitors. That's one kind of inequality between age and generation, and it also triggers exclusion. Then there's also inequalities between the migrants and natives, because some natives has this financial condition to support themselves, to develop a build toilets in their homes, whilst migrants tend to save money so that they can support their home back in rural area, which means migrants tend to cluster in place where sanitation access is the most restricted, and that causes issue and inequalities too. And as a female researcher, I'm also very aware of gender inequality. If I may play this very short video clip. This lady is 80 years old. She's living with her son, but for decades of time, somehow cleaning night pods is considered her responsibility and her responsibility only. And this is a common phenomenon in this urban area, that women do not only have more restricted access to sanitation, they also have to take the burden of domestic sanitation labor. So this is another kind of inequalities that I identify in my field study. So currently, many of my works are developed around these different kinds of inequalities and how the proper implantation and management of sanitation infrasystems can tackle these issues. Now, because of these struggles and inequalities are experienced by the very much marginalized social groups, they're not documented or noted in mainstream discussion. So the way I choose to uncover this issue is urban ethnography, which makes me an urban ethnographer. So as I promised, I'm going to show you something raw, which means I'm going to show you how urban ethnography is done and the process of it, rather than just present you the complete work. Now, I believe 2 weeks ago, Professor Stephen Walker has introduced you urban ethnography as a distinctive research method in certain scenarios. So my narrative here will be very case-specific demonstration of that methodology. So this is my usual spot when I'm doing my urban ethnography in these yet-to-be-transformed urban environments. I arrive here and sit on one of these chairs every day at 8 a.m. to talk with residents, either natives or migrants. And I've been doing this for 44 days in a row in the year of 2019. That allows me to gain much thick information with regard to local sanitation normality, the usage of sanitation infrasystem, how social relation and inequalities are triggered. Many of my information, besides being written into academic paper, are noted and recorded in my field notes, which I called as the ethnographer's diary. So you can see that I write down random thinkings and informations, which are probably not directly relevant to my research, but these provide me information in terms of to understanding local sanitation normality and social relations. So I take pictures, I walk to surrounding public sanitation facilities, I observe how many people come to the waste collection station and use it, and write down the time and the frequency. And this is a classic or very conventional way of conducting urban ethnography. And this information is very important in forming a expected thick description. This is just a quick demonstration of the participants that I've worked with and talked with, and over time we managed to develop this solid relationship that allows me to go into their home, understanding their everyday sanitation practice, understanding the facilities and infrastructures that they're relying on, and understanding the issues lying behind these phenomena. But to gain a bigger picture, I also need to zoom out from individual experience and encounters to look at how infrastructure systems are implanted and managed and planned at municipal level, who manage them, who make the decisions. So that leads to another part of my research, which is policy and governance review. But it is less relevant to my ethnography, so I'm going to leave that aside. But just so you know that we also need to zoom in and zoom out to different big and small scenarios in order to gain an overall understanding of urban infrasystem. Now, because ethnography can be a rather subjective method compared to some other more quantitatively based research methods, so our identity as researcher, in fact, can impact on research outcome, and it will impact on how we conduct our research. So I reflect on my research identity a lot in conducting urban ethnography. So here is an example that's kindly provided by my lovely colleague, Dr. Daliana Yosifova. So she, as someone who has urban design and architecture design background, decided to use a diagram to map out all the relations between participants and infrasystems. Then she decided to corresponding these relations with on-site photos, so that in her academic writing, there is a very illustrative or visual representation of the information she extracted from the site. Whereas other researchers, conventional ethnography, may have to describe these scenarios using hundreds of words. Dr. Yosifova here decided to translate these words into illustrative demonstrations, which reminds us how important our skills as urban researcher and designer is, and this can be a huge advantage in doing academic research. I, on the other hand, rely on modern technology more to do a more visualized demonstration of what I observed on the site. So I come to the site every day at 5 a.m. and I stay until 11 p.m. to use my phone to record time-lapse video so that I can understand who come to use public sanitation infrasystems. Is the capacity enough to support the local residents? What are the frequency of these infrasystems are being used? And this is what I got from making this very short video. So I guess my point here being that as an urban researcher and a designer, you possess a very interesting skills in terms of extracting information and representing it. And it's rather different to conventional ethnography writing, but do take it as advantage rather than disadvantage. Again, I also reflect on my identity as a female researcher. So when I was doing my field study, when I was on site, I also work with my participants and understand their advocacy path and route in seeking public sanitation facilities, because they do not have private access to sanitation water at home. They have to walk out to their home, to the city, to seek public facilities in order to support their most fundamental physical need. That triggers a very interesting discussion that migrants' perception and residents in these areas' perception of home is different to that of ours, because our home is a self-sustained concept and every need is supported at home. Every facilities we can find at home. We do not need to walk out of home, walk out of community to wash our hands, while for residents in this area, this is necessary, which means the boundary between their home and the city has become very blurry. This has affected the way they perceive their urban home, and among migrants, particularly migrant women who are most disadvantaged in access sanitation, this has triggered their longing of their permanent home back in rural area. So one of my papers currently being developed is centered around the perception of home and the boundary between home and the city, because while we possess different access to sanitation and water, that affects on the borderline between home and the urban. How is this relevant to my identity as urban researcher? I think this working with participant method is only feasible because I am a woman too. So imagine if a male researcher is conducting walk-along interview with migrant women and following them to public sanitation facilities and asking them about their everyday sanitation experience and practice. That would be a very odd thing and alarming thing to do. So I would imagine if it's not for my identity as a female researcher, I have to come up with a different research method to conduct this research. Now, the last subsection of my presentation today is to try to show you the trajectory of how my research identity is formed and how you sort of scope down to the topic that interests you the most. So my point here in this section is that all of your research experience and encounter will somewhat contribute to my final work. And in your case, that will be your dissertation. So do not worry too much at the very beginning and do be open-minded to different possibilities. My trajectory is rather interesting. So I was not trained as a urban ethnographer. So when I first started doing my research work, I was not doing urban ethnography at all. I was in fact trained a urban historian. So what I look is much more about how cities come to be, what are their histories, and how we preserve these historical fabric in contemporary cities. So this is this is my first research job. I've graduated from my postgraduate back in Sheffield. I was appointed to evaluate and archive different architectural repairment and preservation practices in China's World Heritage Sites. Now, I was considered a member among the professional team. So if we look at the first picture here, I was among this group. We wear decent clothes and we visit these World Heritage sites that are currently being repaired, probably once or twice every month. And we evaluate the work that have been done to these sites, and we write down the evaluation report to judge if these are being appropriately practice or not. However, in my work, I've grown fond of the observation of the workers and craftsmen who are doing this repairment and preservation. And if you can look carefully on picture number 1, you can in fact see the clothes of the workers and craftsmen being hanging out in the World Heritage Site. So compared to us, who only visit these sites once or twice a month, they live in the site every day. And repairing World Heritage Site, these architectures, is an integral part of their everyday life. And knowledge and experience are shared among workers and craftsmen in a different way that we share knowledge among the so-called professionals. So that's when I first become interested in doing ethnography of these practitioners and craftsmen instead of the very formal professionals. Then in my PhD, I look at Eastern China's rural to urban transformation. So very much about how rural areas are being transformed into small towns or peri-urban areas. And I also look at the so-called informal architectural and urban practices, i.e. how local residents and professionals develop their own houses and living areas without the guide or intervene of professional planners or urban designers. And as you can see from here, that my work also largely integrates my drawing skills and mapping skills, where I use figure ground drawings to demonstrate the changing fabric of my study area. And again, I will imagine a traditional ethnography will use word description rather than figure ground drawings to indicate the background. So this is how I come to be to my urban ethnographer, and how I try to be clear about my identity as a previous urban research designer and now an urban researcher. And I think this is somewhat helpful to you when you're scoping down to your research interests and when you to try to sort of establish your own identity as a first-time researcher. And any questions, I'm very happy to discuss. My email is attached in the first slide of this presentation. Anything about Global South urban transformation and sanitation infrastructure, you're very welcome to drop me an email and we can discuss further. And I think I am on time. Thank you very much. Now, question time.
Hello, this is Vicky. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Well, I have I have some question. Well, not a specific question to ask, but because the place that you have explained, and I've been to there, I remember it was 2013. So I've actually seen how the condition that people live. It's literally like how you described, and then I haven't gone back for many years because. I remember during that year that many houses was demolished by the government, and they moved the residents somewhere else. I didn't know where, but so I want to maybe it's just a question like how the condition of people living there, because I guess the residence is completely changed because the people was moving somewhere else, and then now it's like more like a better quality of which those investors invest, like kind of like nice apartment, some of them. So they're expensive housing, and people are completely different who lives there. So is there something, like, because you're talking about transformation, like everything. So what about now, like the recent?
Talking about transportation again.
You mean what about the remaining yet to be transformed urban area?
Yes.
That do not have access. Yes. If I may reshare my screen, I'm going to show you one of the pictures. Can you see this picture of mine, which is my usual spot of conducting urban ethnography in one of these old community? Oh, this one.
Right, yes.
So this is a common pattern of this remaining yet to be transformed urban area. So it's very common to see that they are right next to the high-rise buildings. And the reason for that is that the land price has become more and more expensive. So it has become more and more expensive for the private investor or the government to demolish a old urban area. So these remaining areas tend to be fragmented, whenever there is investment coming, they demolish a small part of it and develop either commercial center or high-rise building, which brings them higher profit. So today in central Shanghai, many of the remaining yet to be transformed area are right next to high-rise buildings. And many of these high-rise buildings are in fact built on the original site of one of the previous part of this remaining community or neighborhood, which triggers a serious social issue that the residents in this remaining yet to be transformed area are become more and more anxiety and more angry because they are seeing their neighbors' house being demolished and neighbors being assigned to nice modern apartment. They've been seeing very gentrified urban typology being developed right next to their neighborhood, which is this nice high-rising apartment building, which causes multiple billions to purchase even one apartment. So I would say that while its living environment is remaining very much unchanged in these yet to be transformed urban areas, social exclusion and feeling of inequalities are increasing rapidly. If that partially answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Any other questions?
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. This is Tao Fang. For this part, for the urban research part, I want to ask, because you mentioned some of this building, some of them have demolished and to transfer to high development.
Yeah.
This is one typology, and I think why those buildings remain to and I think there are some other meanings, like some cultural meaning, or some old lifestyle meaning. So do they have another typology to show how to develop this quality, like based on those typology? and like you said, maybe improve the life quality, like add toilets in different house, not many house use one, maybe can like one house have one toilet, like those development. So just
yes, brilliant question. Yeah, this is definitely a brilliant question. So I thought about include a slide to show you some of the redevelopment programs that Shanghai government has been pushing in recent years that aim to increase sanitation access in these yet to be transformed urban typology. But then I thought that deserves a whole another presentation, and that's just a whole lot of information. So I did not actually include that slide. But spot on question. So Shanghai government is thinking about possibilities of preserving some of these massive yet to be transformed urban area by increasing sanitation access in-house. So one of the practice they're currently experimenting in inner Shanghai is that they demolish these old houses, but they rebuild new houses that looks almost exactly identical to these old houses on the original site, so that urban fabric or historical typology are being preserved. Then they redo the interior design and make each room a individual small apartment where every household will have their own toilet, and the average building area of this newly built bathroom or toilet will be 0.8 to 1 square meter. So it's very, very tiny, because commonly these houses, one houses are shared among 5 to 6 households, which means even though an old house is being rebuilt or redeveloped, they need to accommodate about 5 to 6 individual flats within one house, which means building area is tiny. So my studio unit is in fact looking at one of the case in inner Shanghai that has been partially redeveloped, which is the community right here. So this area has been partially redeveloped. So 3 rows within this community, 3 rows of houses has been demolished and rebuilt to their identical original look, and households that are accommodating these houses are provided private sanitation access by giving them a very small bathroom. So Shanghai government is trying to pushing forward a second phase of this program, aiming at transforming the areas, the buildings that we're looking at right now on this picture. But it has been stopped because local residents stood up and decided that they do not want the redevelopment program because there are multiple design flaws. For example, the bathroom is too small. They would rather share within few households rather than having individual tiny bathroom that affect people who probably not even close the door properly. So this is a very ongoing practice, also a ongoing discussion on how the redevelopment and preservation of these areas can be achieved. If you are ever interested in this topic, there is a rather successful project rather than my unit's project that we're looking at, named Chunyangli in inner Shanghai, which is one of the earliest and largest old residential area redevelopment projects. But again, they're doing, in fact, rebuilding rather than redevelopment, because the majority of the houses are being demolished and rebuilt into their identical original look. So if that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Any other questions?
Hi, Yukao. Can I pose a question?
Yeah.
I was wondering, you know how you showed the video and the time lapse that you did?
Yeah.
I was wondering how you went about with your ethics approval. Was it not an issue that you showed kind of, you know?
Yes. Okay, so I in fact went through my ethical review 3 times, which was a torture. So eventually, what we come to agreement to is that all my videos are not showing people's front face. So in the time lapse video, the movement is rather fast. I think it's 8 times of regular movement speed. So no front face can actually be identified. And in my walk along interview, I do not take the video from in front. I walk behind them a little bit so that their front face is not recorded in the video. But I do have a browse at all of the 26 videos I've taken on site, and some parts of these are showing the front face of my participant. So I've kindly asked my colleagues to help me to use some technology to blur their faces. But this is how I do it. So no front face showing and no close shots, and definitely no children involved. And that causes me 3 times of ethical review.
Great.
Just for information. Yeah.
I think that's something useful for the students to know as well.
Yes, yes.
They have to go through an ethics process, and they have to talk about how they're involved with the participants and what kind of information they're going to use from the participants, and they have to anonymize their
this. I think, Dimitri, I think this is an extremely important point. So thank you for raising this up. I think for anyone who's interested in conducting face-to-face research, such as entomography, then you have to plan a time for ethics review, and also plan time for you to contact with the gatekeepers of your studied area. And as Dimitri has just mentioned, ethics review can be a pain. So it would be clever to avoid front face picture taking or video shooting. It will also be clever to not involve or include extremely vulnerable group in your study, for example, children or people with illness or elderly above 90 years old. So these are things that you all need to consider if you're interested in conducting urban ethnography. And I will have to say that ethnography is a method that will cost you a lot of time. For example, in my case, I stayed in one of my sites for 45 days. So it's very time and energy consuming. That's something you want to bear in mind if that's something you want to do in the future. Brilliant. Any other questions?
Hello. I
Hello.
just got another
Yes.
question. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Like you mentioned, how to record your research, like you take photos and take videos. So, I just thought another thing, like to record one person or one specific person who lived here, and how to use their space, and how to the public toilet, and how to have one day life in this part. So maybe for some of those points, like we thought is maybe is a disadvantage, like the public toilet is not convenient or is not enough for the whole community. But there are also, I think there are also advantage, like when you use one public facilities, they may opportunity other people to have communication with other people. Those maybe can improve the community atmosphere. So like it's not like the defensive development in different blocks. Like those community just is more active. So maybe from those aspects, maybe have some advantage. Just my personal thinking. Yeah.
I lost you briefly in the middle of your talking, but I'm guessing your point being using public facilities or having this public access is not a all bad thing. And I think this is a brilliant point. You're basically writing my paper for me. So if we remember that very modernized high-rise urban typology community that I was talking about in Shanghai, the 34th floor community buildings, one of the questions I was having in mind is, in fact, is this absolutely the best solution we can have for modern city? What will happen to the capacity of municipal surface, such as treatment and reuse? What if during COVID-19 quarantine time, tens of thousands of people are staying at their homes and flush at the same time or wash hands at the same time? What does it mean for our natural resources, and what does it mean for the capacity of municipal surface? So I think it's very good for you to question, well, the other way around apparently, but to question, is sharing sanitation facility absolutely the worst, or is public facility the worst scenario? So a very good critical thinking. Another point related to your question was my paper that discusses the blurry boundary between urban home where access to sanitation is not available and to the city where people have to walk out their home to seek for public facilities. And yes, my finding, ethnography findings from the site is that particularly for migrant women, because they do not have toilets at home and because they cannot use community urinal, they have to always walk out to the community for about 6-7 minutes to find a public toilet. But during the process, they have a enriched urban encounter where they talk with their neighbors, they talk to people around the public toilet. They understand the city more, because otherwise their life will be just between work units and their home. But they are forced to walk out of their home to understand the city a little bit more, to understand where are the public facilities, how these facilities functions, what time is the best time for them to walk out of their home and visit the city a little bit. So although not having private sanitation is a huge concern, of course, I still stand with my point. But I do agree with you that sometimes using or relying on public facilities can bring out some urban experience that are not all negative. So very good observation, John.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I have some question. Yeah, as you have mentioned that there are a lot of migrant workers live here. Because those rate is more cheaper. In Shanghai, the house price and the rate is very expensive. In one way, the government are trying to provide the better living space for them. In another way, once the rate be expensive, maybe those migrant workers will live more far away from the city center, and they will find the situation where it's cheaper. So I think it's conflict for this situation. Okay. So how do you think about this?
Again, brilliant point. If I may refer to one of my sites, where part of the community is being redeveloped by the government, and the residents are provided with new flats, and they've got private access to sanitation, which means they've got a little tiny bathroom. I've observed a very explicit phenomenon where migrant workers used to reside in these houses are being pushed away, because after the redevelopment, although private access to sanitation have been provided, houses have become newer and fancier because of the new private bathroom, and rent has increased. So in the area that has not been transformed, the rent of a single room which do not have access to sanitation costs about 800 to 1,000 yuan, which is rather cheap in Shanghai, very, very cheap in inner Shanghai, if I may say. But after the redevelopment of the old houses in the same community, the rent will cost more than 2,000 yuan, which means migrants will no longer live in these houses, and they being pushed further away to the edge of Shanghai, or some migrants will just move to other cities where they can afford their housing. Shanghai is in fact have a population decrease, which is mostly triggered by the outflowing of migrant workers. And for a mega city like Shanghai, this is hugely concerning, because there got to be people who are doing light labor work who have to serve the city. But 3 years in a row, migrant population in Shanghai are decreasing. And one of the most significant reasons is that these urban areas are being transformed, being gentrified, and rent has been increasing tremendously. So very good point as well.
Thank you.
Good. Any other questions? Good. If you've got no immediate question, then you're always welcome to drop me an email with regard to Global South Cities, urban transformations, and sanitation access. Now, Lucy, should we push the progress forward to next lecture? Are we still on time?
Yes, we're on time. We've got time for the scheduled break as well.
Brilliant.
So back at 11:15 on this same channel. We'll just leave the meeting open for Angela's lecture on climate resilience.
Super. So 10 minutes break. I will see everyone in 10 minutes. Thank you very much.